Over the course of evolutionary history, we humans have changed quite a bit in some ways, often for the better. But we've also missed out on some really cool abilities that other creatures have. And while we have a lot of complex history to look back on, it doesn't end there. We also have a lot to look forward to. So let's start our journey through human evolution by taking a look at an image that a lot of people are familiar with, and how it has led to some misconceptions. Along with the double helix and the famous blue marble photo of the Earth taken from space, it's probably one of the most recognizable scientific images in the world, a depiction of human evolution in just 6 easy steps. But of course, as professional wrestling and pretty much all of reality television has shown us, just because something is popular doesn't mean that it's an accurate depiction of reality. Let me walk you through it. You probably recognize the naked guy on the right. That's Homo sapiens, an anatomically modern human. The guy who seems to be stalking him is labeled Cro-Magnon, a rough-looking customer who I'll talk about more in a minute. Behind him is Neanderthal, on his heels are Ramapithecus, then Oreopithecus, which sounds delicious, and finally, a tiny monkey-like early ape known as Dryopithecus. The idea of this evolving from this may seem like it's right out of the 19th century, but these images actually first appeared in 1965 in a volume published by Time Life Books called Early Man. And in its defense, the book wasn't exactly trying to say that we evolved right from that hairy little homunculus. Instead, the book, written by anthropologist F. Clark Howell, offered a relatively nuanced discussion of human evolution for the time, and it even warned against interpreting the illustration literally as a progression from one species directly to the next. But the book sold well, and the illustration became extremely popular. And even though the picture originally included 15 different primates in a row and was called The Road to Homo sapiens, the abbreviated version of it became known as the March of Progress. And thus, one of science's most pernicious memes was born. So, what's wrong with this picture? Well, first of all, there are only males in this picture. Humans, like most animals, reproduce sexually, which means we come in 2 distinct flavors, and they make our existence possible. Teaching the history of our development with only one sex is like trying to eat sushi with only one chopstick. You're just not gonna get it all. Next, we're not even directly related to some of those guys. Like, as Howell himself pointed out, Oreopithecus was kind of a bit player in the human drama. It lived for a few million years in what's now southern Europe, but disappeared rather quickly. And the latest research suggests that it probably wasn't even bipedal, as you see here. Then there's Cro-Magnon. While that was kind of a catch-all phrase for primitive humans 50 years ago, the specimen that the term was based on turned out to be a modern Homo sapien, so they're generally no longer considered to even be a thing. We also did not evolve from Neanderthals, as the picture suggests. Modern humans and Neanderthals actually coexisted until about 40,000 years ago. We were contemporaries, with a shared common ancestor. But they turned out to be unable to adapt to all the changes in the world around them, including the arrival of us. And that's by far the most important problem with this image. Evolution isn't a linear process. It doesn't turn one species into another. It's really about genetics. Organisms are constantly developing new adaptations, and the ones with the adaptations that make them most fit for their environment end up reproducing more and spreading their genes all over the place. Scientists call that being evolutionarily successful, and there are plenty of other organisms with whom we share ancestors that are just as successful, like chimps and orangutans, because they continue to exist and evolve like we do. If you had to express it visually, the human story probably would look more like an incredibly complex tree, or maybe more of a fractal, with many stubs and branches, some of which extend to the present time while others taper out. But it definitely would not resemble some kind of primate police lineup. So we are not the end-all be-all of evolution. Chimps have been going at it right alongside us. We should have some respect for chimps, but this next video might be taking that to the extreme. So scientists are currently gossiping up a storm about the fact that our early ancestors, the first Homo sapiens, may have interbred with some other species, which is weird. It's long been accepted by the scientific community that Homo sapiens, like me, and probably you, originated in Africa around 200,000 years ago. As far as we can tell, they stayed there for about 140,000 years until they started to get frisky and struck out into the unknown. And one of the things that those adventurous humans discovered out there in the wide world was an older, more primitive, bigger-boned species of great ape that we call Neanderthal. You may call them Neanderthals, but we, in the scientific community, call them Neanderthals because that's what they called themselves. Actually, it's because that's what the cave where their first fossils were found was called. It was a Neanderthal, not Neanderthal. It's just how they spell it. Neanderthals are, of course, related to humans, but their evolutionary lines had split about 350,000 years before. But just because Neanderthals and humans were not the same species, did that prevent them from getting it on? No, and it appears that we were similar enough species that we were actually able to create viable offspring. Studies have shown that despite the fact that Neanderthals went extinct about 40,000 years ago, they live on. In us. According to this research, between 1 and 4% of human DNA is actually Neanderthal DNA. So you might as well unstitch your family crest from your smoking jacket. But Neanderthals might actually not be the only ancient hominids that humankind had intimate relations with. The recently discovered Denisovans, which probably shared more in common with Neanderthals than with humans, are showing up in the genome of people all over Southeast Asia. So it turns out that we had a lot more choices of people, or sort of people, to mate with back in the olden days. But we're not done messing with your conception of what humanity is yet, because it turns out that some of your ancestors may in fact have had sexy times with gorillas. The reason they think this is not to do with our genome, it's to do with the genome of lice. And stick with me, because yeah, I bet you're probably clicking away from the video right now. So most species of mammals have one species of lice that's specific to them. It lives on them and only them, but all over them. Now humans are a little different. Because we have isolated pockets of hair, we actually have two species of lice. We have head lice and we have pubic lice. And that's different from every other mammal's lice. But our pubic lice is very, very surprisingly and upsettingly similar to the species that lives on gorillas. No! God, no! Why did we even look into this? But even if our ancestors were having sex with the ancestors of gorillas, which hopefully they weren't, I'm still keeping that as a possibility in my mind. It probably was happening something like 3.3 million years ago, so you probably don't have to run straight to the shower and scrub your skin off with a pumice stone at the moment. But still, dang, Australopithecus, you dirty dog. So we know that there's shades of gray among human ancestral species, but how do we know when early humans were around? The answer, at least in some cases, lies in electrons. You and I might be older than we thought. Not us personally, us as in Homo sapiens, or anatomically modern humans. That's a term that refers to someone whose bone structure falls within the range of humans alive today. Someone who wouldn't look too out of place if you just saw them walking down the street. For a long time, fossil evidence for anatomically modern humans went back less than 200,000 years. But an international team of researchers publishing this month in the journal Nature have found what they're calling early Homo sapiens fossils that are around 300,000 years old at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. This research has been making headlines as a scientific breakthrough, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. What we can say for sure is that these papers are more evidence in an ongoing anthropological puzzle, and we should keep revising our ideas of exactly when, where, and how we first evolved. We know anatomically modern humans arose from archaic humans like Homo erectus in Africa, and the 200,000-year figure has been pretty persistent, but there have been hints that Homo sapiens is actually older than that. For one thing, a DNA study published last year suggests ancestral humans might have diverged genetically from ancestral Neanderthals more than 500,000 years ago. We've also found fossils older than 200,000 years that look like Homo sapiens, but they were too fragmentary to be sure. Before these recent papers, the fossils from Jebel Irhoud didn't seem like important evidence in this age debate. The site has yielded hominin fossils since 1960, but sloppy or inaccurate dating led researchers to think they were as young as 40,000 years. One estimate based on radioactive uranium and a technique called electron spin resonance put them at around 160,000 years old. Even that is kind of boring if you're looking for human origins, so the site was consistently overlooked. But the current find involves new excavations and a dating technique that turned the clock back past 300,000 years. The excavations found new hominin fossils near flint tools, along with charcoal and burned mammal bones, which suggests they were probably using fire. Some of the tools were cracked as if they'd been heated, and that opened them up to a dating technique known as thermoluminescence. Crystals of certain common minerals like flint, which is a form of quartz, tend to trap electrons over time. Those electrons come from a source like sunlight or the natural radioactive decay of elements in the ground. When those crystals get heated up, the electrons get enough energy to escape. The crystals zero out, out and then start building up electrons again. When some early Homo sapiens let their tools get toasty, they reset the electron content of the quartz crystals. And because electrons build up at a steady rate, it creates an electron clock. The number of electrons is proportional to how long it's been since the crystals were last heated. The researchers then heated the tools again, which forced the electrons out in the form of weak light. By measuring that light, they could tell how long it had been since those tools got left in the flames, and then use that to estimate the age of the fossils found in nearby rock. The number they came up with was around 315,000 years, plus or minus a few. And then they double-checked by doing some more radioactive uranium and electron spin resonance dating on a fossilized tooth, which gave them an estimate of around 286,000 years. So the fossil ages are pretty solid, but researchers don't entirely agree about how much they shake up the picture of when and where anatomically modern humans emerged. Modern humans from the last 130,000 years have relatively small faces and globe-shaped brain cases, which is the back part of your skull. The Jabal-Irhoud hominins shared the small faces, but their brain cases were more elongated than what you would see in people today. Earlier thinking had modern humans arising in a rapid evolutionary event 200,000 years ago, taking place somewhere in East Africa, in which our faces and brain cases both changed from ancestral hominins. This research isn't the first to question that thinking, but the mix of archaic and modern traits in these fossils might mean a couple of things. For one, the sudden emergence of anatomically modern humans is probably thanks to the fossil record, not a real event. The Jabal-Irhoud fossils suggest a transitional form in which humans evolved small faces early or even kept them from an archaic ancestor and didn't get the modern brain case until later. So even though it's flashy and exciting to claim that these are the earliest Homo sapiens, it isn't necessarily a clear-cut label. The paper authors say that these fossils are early Homo sapiens, and most scientists seem to agree that these are our direct ancestors at the very least. Whether you consider them recent humans or not, this discovery also suggests that hominins like the Irhoud folks were living all over Africa. The study authors point to 260,000-year-old fragmentary remains from South Africa, which their research confirms could plausibly be Homo sapiens. South Africa isn't exactly an afternoon stroll from Morocco, and neither are terribly close to a hypothetical East African origin for modern humans. The researchers say all of this evidence points to a Pan-African view of human evolution, with no one site being the unique cradle of humanity. As is often the case in biology, it was more of a mess. A mess that's elegant in its complexity because it all fits together if you can find all the evidence, which we are still doing. So we're just using what we have available to us to make the best timeline we can make. Along that timeline, there were also some things we lost along the way. Here's Michael to explain what evolution actually took from us.
A common misconception about natural selection and evolution as a whole is that it's essentially a long chain of progress, adding on new features over and over again. But evolution doesn't always add stuff. Sometimes it takes away traits too. That's because natural selection only favors traits that help an animal reproduce or survive until it can reproduce. If a trait doesn't do that, it's not selected for. In fact, it might start to disappear thanks to mutations piling up. That's known as relaxed selection, because natural selection no longer maintains the trait. If the trait takes a lot of energy for the organism to maintain, there can even be a selective pressure to lose it. Human evolution contains plenty of examples of this. In fact, there's a whole host of things our distant ancestors could do that we just can't anymore. From pheromone signaling to detecting electricity, here are some weird abilities evolution has denied us. First up, the so-called third eye. If you take a look at some lizards or frogs, you might see something that looks like a small grayish dot on their forehead. This isn't a scale, it's actually an organ called a pineal or parietal eye. It detects light, and scientists think it functions as kind of a daylight sensor, a way to keep track of seasons and how long the days are. It also synthesizes melatonin, a hormone that helps regulate biological cycles related to sleep, reproduction, and body temperature. Parietal eyes are likely very old. The evidence can be seen in the fossil record, including the skulls of long-dead precursors of mammals. It's an opening in the skull called the parietal foramen, and in life it accommodates the parietal eye and its associated nerves. But a 2016 study found something interesting. Looking at the skulls of mammal ancestors, the researchers observed that the foramen, and the eye presumably, gradually became both smaller and less common around 245 to 260 60 million years ago. The researchers suggest its disappearance is evidence of one of two things. One, cells in the animal's normal eyes might have essentially taken over the pineal eye's duty of sensing daylight length and seasonal change. Or two, the loss of the pineal eye might be evidence that the animals were becoming warm-blooded and better able to regulate their body temperature. Thus, being able to sense how long the nice warm sun was out through the top of their head became less useful. Either way, the organ wasn't as adaptive as it had been, and the selection pressure to keep it waned. Today, we've kept part of the organ around in the form of the pineal gland in our brains, which still synthesizes melatonin. But we no longer need an extra eye in the middle of our forehead for it to work. Another ability we lost during evolution is electroreception. This is the ability of some fish and amphibians to detect weak electric fields. The electric eel, for example, can use it to navigate or detect prey in their sometimes murky river habitat. You can even see the organs responsible for it in the lateral line on some sharks and fish. While not super common today, it's found in a wide array of different lineages, suggesting it might have also been a trait found in very early vertebrates. However, our ancestors seem to have lost the system with the transition to living on land. Why? It just might not have really worked as well in the air compared to water. And again, traits that don't confer selective advantages are apt to disappear. Funnily enough, later on, some mammals such as platypuses, echidnas, certain dolphins, and maybe others did end up evolving electroreception again, but through completely different mechanisms, and we're not totally sure what they're for. Finally, let's talk about the Jacobson's organ, aka the vomeronasal organ. This structure is found inside the nose, and it's used to sense odors and pheromones. When a snake flicks its tongue in and out, it's using its Jacobson's organ. And that weird face horses and cats make sometimes? Same thing, it's called the Flamen response. We have a vomeronasal organ too, but it doesn't really seem to work. The topic of whether humans can sense pheromones at all is kind of contentious. But by the time we're adults, our Jacobson's organ has no sensory neurons connected to it, and most researchers believe it doesn't send our brains any information. And we have a handful of genes that in other animals make the vomeronasal organ work. But in us, those genes are non-functional. As for when we lost it, a study from 2003 dated the inactivation of these genes to around 23 million years ago, about when the great apes split from monkeys. That might correspond to apes' visual systems becoming more advanced, and visual cues becoming more important than sense during social and reproductive activities. In fact, we might still be in the process of losing the genes associated with our Jacobson's organ, totally at random. Mutations happen all the time in our genome, altering or deactivating genes, and without selective pressure to stop those mutations from building up, eventually, the trait those genes contribute to can disappear. Natural selection isn't just a matter of continually adding on new features. If something isn't helping an organism produce offspring, that feature is likely to get left behind in the long run. The reason we don't have third eyes or any of these other neat traits is that, in the end, we ended up getting along fine without them.
Since other mammals have re-evolved their electroreception powers, who's to say that we won't do that too in the future? Well, here is what the future of human evolution might look like.
Evolution has given us some useful abilities. Over the past millions of years, we've evolved to stand on two legs, use tools, and develop language. And as recently as a few thousand years ago, humans were still evolving. Part of what drives evolution is natural selection, where those with traits that make them better adapted to their environment tend to survive long enough to pass on those traits to their offspring. Modern medicine can sometimes interfere with that process, since it keeps people alive who maybe otherwise wouldn't be. But that doesn't mean humans are done evolving. One recent example of human evolution is the fact that 35% of adult humans can digest milk. 7,000 years ago, not nearly as many people could do that. Instead, mainly babies drank and digested milk so they could get energy from the lactose in their mother's breast milk. Once they grew up, though, the gene that allowed them to digest milk was switched off. But when we domesticated cattle, the mutation that allowed certain people to digest milk as adults became something that helped them survive, since they had an extra source of nutrition. A few thousand years later, being able to digest lactose is pretty normal. So humans were still evolving in the not-so-distant past. And a lot of scientists think that we still are, and we might even be able to predict what future humans will be like. For one thing, it's possible that in the future, women will be shorter and slightly heavier than they are now. Researchers figured this out using the data from the Framingham Heart Study, which tracks the medical histories of more than 14,000 people who live in Framingham, Massachusetts. The team wanted to know what traits gave women higher reproductive success. They found that shorter, slightly heavier women tended to have more children, and that those traits were passed on to their children. If this trend continues, in 10 generations, the average woman might be about 2 centimeters centimeters shorter and a kilogram heavier. Another possible difference between us and future humans is that their brains might be a bit smaller. Which is weird because for most of human history, brain sizes tended to get bigger over time. But over the last 20,000 years, the brain size of Homo sapiens has decreased. During that time, the average volume of the male brain has shrunk from about 1,500 cubic centimeters to about 1,350, about a tennis ball size difference. A similar decrease in brain size happened for women too. But why the change? One possibility is that our brains are smaller thanks to the emergence of more complex societies. As population density increased and there was more division of labor, humans didn't have to be as smart to stay alive, so their brains didn't have to be as big. Other scientists think our brains have been shrinking because we've become more tame. See, domesticated animals have smaller brains than their wild counterparts, probably because if a wild animal isn't smart enough, it won't survive too long. So like domesticated animals, maybe our brains have gotten smaller because we aren't constantly worried about things like being attacked by predators. But a shrinking brain might not mean the human species is getting dumber. Instead, our brains might just be getting more efficient. Having a big brain uses up a lot of energy, so if it's a little smaller and more efficient, we don't need as much energy to stay alive. That said, a recent study of the skulls of Americans showed that they've actually been getting bigger since the mid-1800s. But that's probably because of better nutrition and not an evolutionary change. So if we factor out the effect of better nutrition, it's possible that the shrinking trend will continue into the future. Even if natural selection isn't what drives the future evolution of our species, we might artificially evolve ourselves through genetic engineering. As we learn more about what all of our genes do and how to modify them, we'll be able to eliminate certain genetic disorders and maybe even diseases related to getting older. And eventually, we might be able to design people like we design avatars in video games, altering things like height, intelligence, athleticism, or any other trait. So whether the changes are natural or artificial, humans of the future might be very different.
Well, I, for one, am pretty disappointed that breathing underwater is not on that list, and also I would like to have venom, thank you very much. But with the technology that we have developed, like oxygen tanks and plenty of poisons we've created, it seems like we're doing pretty okay for ourselves. Thank you for watching this episode of SciShow. If you liked it, you might also like our video on humanity's continued evolution.